Today, I'm honored to welcome Anita McBride to our show. Anita served as the Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush, directing her groundbreaking work on global health, education, literacy, as well as women's empowerment. She's one of the longest serving women in the White House history, with senior roles across three presidential administrations. Today, she's the executive in residence at the American University, where she leads the First Ladies Initiative, and she serves as a co chair of In Pursuit, a major nonpartisan civic education project marking America's 250th anniversary. We chatted about her White House experiences, the powerful but often underappreciated role of First Ladies, and the leadership lessons we can draw from history as we head toward 2027. I hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation. Anita, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to
S-
be with you.
So let's talk about this because you served as the chief of staff to the First Lady, Laura Bush, but also held senior roles across different administrations. What first drew you to this career of history and politics, and how did all of that bring you to the White House?
Mhm. Well, it is a little bit of a winding story, but like most people's journeys, there's pivots along the way. I mean, I went to a college, University of Connecticut, as a pre med major. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go into medicine. And, I had to read um, the tea leaves that the too many failing chemistry test was not a prescription for success in medicine. And it caused me to make a major change, which was sign up for a junior year abroad program, which I did to Italy for a year. My heritage is Italian, so I had background in the language, although didn't speak it, but I certainly learned it there. But it was a very pivotal moment in world history. It was 1979, within months of living overseas as a 19-year-old, the American hostages were taken in Iran. And the response amongst young people in particular, where I was in Florence, Italy, and young students from all over the world, really, and many from the Middle East. The response of almost celebrating the fact that this had happened to Americans was very shocking to me. And so I guess the way I would describe it is I had to leave my country to appreciate my country. And when I came back home in 1980, after my year was finished, it was the height of the presidential campaign between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. So Governor Reagan and incumbent President Jimmy Carter. And I joined the campaign as a volunteer. I went back to school, of course, in a senior year, but I would drive from the campus to Hartford, Connecticut and volunteer at the campaign. Governor Reagan won. And so I wanted to move to Washington. And that's how it started. This is 1981. And, I didn't know really anybody. It took a while before I, had some breakthroughs and ultimately worked in the reelection campaign of 84 in Washington. And that's where I met more people because it really is all about meeting people and earning your way in, but making connections. And I got hired to the White House. And in 1984, in the beginning of the second term, reading the mail that came into the President of the United States. That's what I was doing, sitting in the basement of the now Eisenhower Executive Office building, reading the mail that came to the president. The woman that trained me how to read mail had been hired in the Franklin Roosevelt administration. She was still
Wow.
reading mail and still training people. But that was the start. And I loved it. I loved being in Washington. I loved being in the nation's capital where local news is national news and national news is international news. And, the 12 years of the Reagan Bush administration gave me many opportunities to grow and to be hired into other positions, management and administration. I ultimately became director of White House personnel in the end of the Reagan administration, all of George H.W. Bush's White House years. And that gave me such great experience to understand how the White House operates, um, all of the all of the people at all levels that I met And then got hired back in 2000 because we all remember the election of 2000, that we didn't know for weeks who the president was going to be, because of the contested election of Al Gore and George W. Bush. And once it was decided, or even before it was decided, I'd been asked to help, be prepared to go into the White House and set up a personnel operation, which is what I did. And then I said, "Well, at this point now, I'm married. I have 2 little kids, 3 months old and 3 years old. I'll help you for about 4 months, until you get, everyone established." And that turned into 8 years of
Wow.
incredible experiences working at the White House, living through 9/11, evacuating the White House, and getting people to safety, coming back and helping to set up a whole new operation at the White House, and, going to the State Department, and then ultimately being hired by Laura Bush as her chief of staff, which is not a position you can just apply for. It just, I was very grateful to get a call to say she wanted to speak to me. We had a great conversation about it, and she hired me, and the rest is
Wow.
history.
Amazing. It's so much to unpack here, and
There's a
it's so
lot.
funny because there's a lot. I mean, again, you've lived through so much. The first thing that just popped in my head that I would really wanna know is I have to go back and start at the beginning with the mailroom. Were
Yeah.
there any crazy things? Like, what is sent over to the White House? I'm
Yes.
just curious.
Well, thousands and thousands of pieces of mail, and remember back then, this is 1984, there were no computers really, there was no email. This everything came in big bags from the US Postal Service, big white bags that you'd open up and you'd slice open the envelope and you read it. You were trained how to code, so it would have the proper disposition. It may be someone writing in about a hardship case. And we got a lot of those. And I remember some of those, like widows writing, just saying they worried about if they were going to lose their social security, or that, Medicare was too expensive. And some samples of letters like that would go into a daily folder for President Reagan to read, both pro
Wow.
and con mail, which was part of what, I would doing there. And, we'd have people writing in from overseas, really protesting the fact that President Reagan was negotiating to put Pershing 2 missiles in Germany. Again, this was all the anti Soviet threat or the Soviet threat that he was combating. So it can go from any domestic, issues that people worried about their livelihoods, to global letters, people complaining about what the president was doing. Little kids' mail was sometimes just the best. And there's a cute book about kids' letters to President Reagan, and there are to other presidents too. Um, Letters to the first lady would come in, but everything got a response, not all from the president, although he took a sample that he responded to personally. And we would see those letters come back handwritten on yellow, legal paper, that the legal notepads that he'd like to write on. And we would type up the responses and send those out. I also saw times where President Reagan wrote personal checks to people. I don't know whether they ever got cashed. But he also had a pen pal in Washington, D.C., a young African American boy in the Anacostia region of Washington that most people never, ever knew about.
Wow. That's a story.
Mhm. It
There's
is
your
a
next book.
story. It is a story. I know, it's a great story. He and Mrs. Reagan went in and, had, dinner on little, TV tray tables at their house at, one point. Again, just, at the end of the day, I like to say, Peter, our elected leaders are human beings, and their husbands and their fathers and their grandfathers. And what I loved about my job in correspondence is, the majority of the 350 million Americans that we have will never meet or see the president of the United States, but they can write to the president of the United States, and they can
That's amazing.
somebody will read their letter and will make a decision about how it gets responded to. And then crazy stuff like gifts would come in from all over. There was a whole unit that handled gifts. people would needlepoint or people would hook rugs or they'd send some, crazy looking
Wow.
that they wanted the president to have. And all those things, really do become presidential records. They're stored in the archives somewhere.
Wow. That's there might be like a crochet thing
Oh,
somewhere.
a ton of stuff like that. And gifts from people overseas too, and when we traveled overseas, because then later, of course, in my other position with Mrs. Bush and part of an official traveling party, you'd get, gifts from heads of state too, and those all belong to the American people. They belong
Yeah.
to the government.
Wow. And you mentioned this, and this was not initially part of my questions, but 9/11 must have been. I mean, it was traumatizing for all of us, but you were like right there at the center.
Mhm,
What was that like?
mm. It's interesting. At the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I was asked to write an article for the White House Historical Association to document what happened in the White House that day with the staff that was there. Where did they go? What did they do? How was the evacuation carried out? What were their recollections? Before it gets too late, we needed to document these stories because we know where the president was and the vice president and some of the, leadership, but where was everyone else? And so it was such an amazing reminder for me of how we just had to, at the moment, respond to something that had never happened to the White House before. Of course, I felt, I worked in the most secure office building in the world. What could possibly happen in this protected, environment? Well, the reality is a lot. And, you know, being told by Secret Service to get everyone out of their offices. We went first to a location in the West Wing that is the White House staff mess, which is sort of underground. It's right next to the Situation Room, so it was thought to be a protected place, but very clearly wasn't. And then just told by the agents to get everybody out, and hearing them, tell young women in high heels, "Take off your shoes and run for your life." That's what it was. And so the gates of the White House on every part of the White House were opened for people to run out. And I ended up in Lafayette Park on the north side of the White House and really looking around at some of the very, very senior people that were around me and knew this wasn't right. They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be here exposed like this. My instinct was to get them, as many people, to a place where we'd have some connectivity because our phones didn't work there. Of course, no one had even Blackberries then. So I made the one call that I felt I could get out, and I did get a call out to my husband who was running the Daimler Chrysler office, the government affairs office in Washington. It was 2 blocks from the White House, and I said, "Of all these people here, Lafayette Park, we really need a place to come." And, he said, "Just bring them here." And so what happened was, 'cause my husband also, I met him in the White House, working in the White House. He had been personal aide to George H.W. Bush as president. He had run the military office. I knew instinctively he would understand how to respond. And so we went there. We ended up 72 people in that office working that day, including the president's speechwriters who wrote his speech that he delivered to the nation that night. The people who planning the president's next few days, what that was going to look like. So schedulers, cabinet officials, leadership, communications people. We worked there that whole day and I think that was the most interesting. And that was the point that I tried to get out in the article that I wrote. No matter what had happened, the grief, the shock, um, people wanted to continue to do their job. They felt compelled to do whatever they could to, help, the president and help the country in these moments. But it was an extraordinary difficult time. But I think, we just did what we had to do.
Wow. This is such a little known story. I absolutely
Yeah, it
love
is.
that.
It is.
Um, From your time working so closely with Mrs. Bush, what surprised you the most about the daily realities and pressures that a first lady has?
Yeah. That's such a great question because this is where I truly had my front row seat to history of the role of first lady and how impactful and important and multifaceted that it is. I mean, I kind of knew that a little bit instinctively, but I think most people view the role as, it's ceremonial, it's a social hostess role. There are issues, of course, that they get involved in. That's been from the beginning. Every first lady has had something that they've cared about. But the thing is, because there is no position description for it, everyone gets to rewrite it the way that they want. And I saw with Mrs. Bush, honestly, I could go from planning a secret trip to Afghanistan in the morning, which we did 3 times, to planning, the state visit of Queen Elizabeth II, which we also did. That's just how varied that it is. And I think what I remember most about being in that role as her chief of staff was going back to my first conversation with her about what she wanted um, to do. And she said, she reminded me, she said, I'm not here for me. I'm here for George and because of George. But I want to use, my time to support his agenda and the things that are of interest to me. Education, of course, was one of them. And so she was a leading figure in education reform. She also really loved to drew inspiration, always had from Lady Bird Johnson and her work on conservation and our natural landscapes. And so Laura Bush was chair of the National Park Foundation, traveled as many national parks as she could, helping to raise money for them, helping to swear in junior rangers all over the country. She cared about women's health, and was an advocate for breast cancer, for women's heart health. I mean, it was just ran the gamut of things that a first lady's leadership could really make a difference. And that's what I saw because, ultimately, I guess I would answer your question with this. Not everyone can get the attention of the president. Every problem in the world comes to the desk of the American president. But a first lady can help support and advocate for things that are important for the administration, but also get to pick and choose the issues they want to work on. She established a national book festival in 2001. It's still going on. That's a legacy of a first lady that, is something to really be proud of how our first ladies can make a difference.
Speak about our first ladies. You've written a book on this. So,
Yes.
you are the authority. Do any of the first ladies really stand out to you, particularly as history making,
Yeah,
from your research?
sure. Yeah, that was a fantastic opportunity for me after leaving the White House, going to work at American University, being asked to set up an initiative that really examines the role of American first ladies throughout our history and their impact on our policy and our politics and our global diplomacy. And after 10 years of doing that and bringing some of the best, experts in this field, scholars, journalists, reporters who had traveled with first ladies themselves, family members, um, you know, uh, trying to document or at least have this body of work that really gives them their voice and their contributions throughout history to the American presidency. So the opportunity to write a book about it with two authors that I have, and I think the publisher was a little skeptical that 3 people could write a book together, but we each had different skills. I was a practitioner. I'd worked in the White House. I'd met many first ladies. Um, One of our other co-authors was a retired archivist. She knew how to get access to important materials. The other had been a college professor and had taught courses on first ladies and always had to cobble together materials. So the idea that we had was to write a textbook, the first ever in history on first ladies. So we covered them all, Martha to Melania, and we just recently also updated the book. But we discovered that I discovered things in particular that I'd never known before, like Sarah Polk, one of the in today's White House, she would be considered the most powerful chief of staff. That's how valuable she was to her husband, James Polk. Helped him in every single campaign, wrote his speeches, read the newspapers for him, clipped what was important, really was one of his best advisors. But and did all this before women had rights and before women even had the right to vote. So her superpower was knowing how to show deference to men, but also be the power behind the scenes. So she's a great example. Of course, Mary Todd Lincoln, one of the most vilified first ladies in history, that really gets a bad rap. Some of the press against her was justified. I mean, spending a 4-year White House appropriation for decorating in 4 months when the stirrings of civil war are around you is probably not a great way to read the room. But there's so much depth to her and what she contributed, what she sacrificed on behalf of the country, knowing that, and her husband, frankly, would not have been president if it weren't for her. She had more belief in him than he had in himself. And so there's so many figure Caroline Harrison, I love this story. 1890s, she's first lady. Again, women still don't have rights. She's asked to raise money for Johns Hopkins Medical School, as all first ladies are asked to shine a light on an initiative or may help bring attention to it or raise money. She agreed to raise money for the medical school if they would admit women for the first time, and they did. So these are these examples, little known examples of leadership that they have shown that they bumped up against the limits that were on them, um, but found a way to use their very unique platform to really help push the nation forward. And we have those examples on civil rights, on human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, the longest serving first lady, the most activist first lady. Of course, she had 12 years to do the job, but also, pleaded with her husband to have a role. He did not want her to have a role, but she found a way to really to do that, including hosting 348 press conferences only with women reporters because they did not have access to the president's press conferences, like the men did.
So it must have been interesting when you got to the chapters where you played an active role in that history, right? Because you're like, okay, how do I put this knowing what you know? And also, did you run any of this by Mrs. Bush? Like, hey, I'm writing this chapter about you. What do you think about this?
Well, the good news is, I had written a couple of chapters for other people's books about Laura Bush, and also had written a chapter for a book that is going to be coming out. It's not out yet, about Barbara Bush, who I also knew, and then had interviewed a reporter, Karen Tumulty, who wrote a book about Nancy Reagan, an excellent book about Nancy Reagan. And so those were the three first ladies that I knew best. I'd met, many others, but I did, what was so good about writing with these other co-authors, we each, drafted chapters of our 18 chapter book, but we shared it with each other. So there was always a review, um, and, a balance that we always made sure that we achieved. But I think the perspective of actually walking history myself and knowing some of these women, understanding and seeing up close, the pressures of trying to lead a private life in the public eye made me much more sensitive to all the other figures in history. I really didn't have difficulty being fair and balanced about the first ladies that I knew. I think I was more sensitive to the ones that I didn't know.
So, Anita, as you trace this for decades, how has the role of the first lady changed, and where is that change going forward? In today's world for the future.
Mhm. It's real. There is a thread of connectivity through all first ladies, from the first to the current. And that is, and I guess I go back and explain that is, Even George Washington knew this was a two-person job. From the minute that he was elected president or sworn in as president, knew that he needed the help of, and luckily for him, Martha was an experienced hostess, but knew he needed her to help set the tone of what this new republic, of the accessibility to citizens, but also maintaining a certain level of formality so that we would be respected on the world stage by, countries that were used to monarchies, not republics, where now it's the people that are in charge. So that the threat of connectivity, first of all, on a couple of things. One, by virtually being spouse of the commander in chief, they are the nation's first military spouse. And that care for military and veterans is a thread that connects all of them, whether that's a male or a female that's going to be in the role of presidential spouse, that's important. The ceremonial role is also something not to be diminished. It's really important, particularly on the global stage. But the growing activism of first ladies, we have an expectation as Americans that first ladies use their platform for something that's important and something that can help move the nation forward. And I think we've seen that in modern first ladies in particular. As I mentioned earlier, Lady Bird Johnson cared about conservation. Eleanor Roosevelt cared about human rights. Laura Bush and Barbara Bush cared about literacy. Nancy Reagan cared about young people being addicted to drugs. And her Just Say No program, although criticized for its simplicity, did have an impact. And, people like Pat Nixon, who felt that raising the importance of voluntarism in our country, citizen participation in the needs of our communities, every single one of them have found a way to use the platform for something they care about. Joe Biden cared about education, continued to work as a teacher. This is where we really do start to see the modern influences on the role, that she was able to have an outside job while also working in the White House. It's something that when we have a female president, perhaps, their male spouse has a job and wants to continue to work. We will adapt. The position will adapt to its occupants. And I think the one example, I guess I would give the most recent example, where we had a female vice president and obviously a male spouse, who served as second gentleman, our first ever. When he was asked the question, "What do you consider to be the most important function for you in this role?" He had a very traditional response, and that was to support the vice president. So, what that should tell us is, at the end of the day, each of these people recognizes they are not the elected official, but they have, and their primary responsibility is the success of the elected leader, and that they will find ways to be engaged, to be helpful, to be supportive, and have their own put their own stamp on the role.
I always say, the great old saying, "Behind every great man is a greater woman." I would be very lost without my wife.
You
I
know what?
probably wouldn't put my shoes on right.
You can't do it alone. And I want to share with you this incredible example. I just went to the Theodore Roosevelt library opening in Medora, North Dakota over the 4th of July holiday. And there is the exhibits are not to be, they are incredible. A lot of AI driven, very interactive. And there's one room where you get to go into the Oval Office and talk to, well, it wasn't Oval at that time, but it was the president's office, and ask the president a question. So I asked Teddy Roosevelt in this AI generated way what he thinks is the most important role, what he thinks of the role of First Lady. And it takes a moment to respond, because what the AI is doing is combing through all of his speeches or remarks or writings about the First Lady. And the response is, President, this is what he said, no president could do it alone. And Edith was a quiet advisor to me. She made the White House a home but she also was this spirit, brought spirit to the American people. And it was really incredible. And that what he said then as president, 1901 to 1909, is still true today.
That sounds amazing.
It was
It's also
amazing.
the power of we're so afraid of AI. But I just did research for an episode on this show when teachers protested against calculators in 1986. Picketed.
Oh, I
Th-
remember.
They're gonna destroy education,
Right.
and then it was the internet later on. That's gonna destroy research. And I mean, don't get me wrong. There's AI could be
Sure.
misused as could everything else,
Sure.
but I think that you just showed that there's a lot of potential here to learn.
So much potential. This presidential library, and I've been to many of them, will be the most enticing for young people because of the way of how interactive that it is and how you in all these other rooms where you can envision yourself as Teddy Roosevelt in his multiple roles, mayor, governor, police commissioner, vice president, president, secretary of the Navy. It is really, I think the location may make it difficult to get large numbers of people there. I hope that they could, but Madura was fascinating. This is where he went, and to heal, recover from his grief of losing his wife and mother on the same day, and but where he led a strenuous life that made him who he is. It's really incredible.
That's amazing. Shifting gears a little bit, you co-chair In Pursuit,
Yes.
which is this nonpartisan civic, education project. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, isn't this In Pursuit is such an exciting project. Again, trying to, in a nutshell, creating a catalog of wisdom for everybody at all ages to examine our leaders, presidents, and select first ladies, many of them, and draw lessons in leadership from them, successes, failures, challenges, short essays, 1,200 words, written by uh, um, prominent people like former presidents and former first ladies, the Supreme Court justice, and then other scholars, journalists, historians, and this putting this all together in a way that is so easily readable and digestible and recorded, in their voices, and put together with historical images, of this snapshot in time where we are learning something about these officials, these elected officials and their spouses throughout our history. It again, I think the quickest way to respond to it is to say this is an extraordinary catalog of wisdom that now will be adapted for middle school and high school curriculum, for college curriculum, and to be shared at all levels. We're really excited about the In Pursuit project, and hopefully that it is, it's an opportunity to continue to learn the lessons of our history long after all the ta-da moments that we have had for the 250th, which we deserve to celebrate as a nation. But it recognizes, that each of these people in our history that have had such an influence on the country were um, could make made mistakes, but also help push the nation forward. It's just a terrific project, a civic education project, as you have said. And it's led by the former archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogan, who was the 11th archivist of the United States. It's a project under the umbrella of the organization More Perfect, which is a collaboration with presidential centers all over the country, all focused on these tools of democracy in our country that we need young people in particular to understand and become active civic participants themselves. But I had said the people who are writing for us have done an incredible job bringing history to life in a lesson on each of these individuals. Hard to do with the small number of words that we gave them.
Yeah, I know Colleen. Colleen was on my show and she was the archivist.
Yes.
Um, but interesting point too. Few things. One, just kind of briefly, this idea of doing it in short words that
Yes.
always gets me. They're like, "Yeah, we want you to tell the story." When I write for different magazines, they're like, "Do it in 1,500 words." I'm like, "I can't do it in
It's
1,500 words."
hard.
Or, that's the hardest part. When you're a teenager and they tell you have to write a 3-page paper, you're like, "Oh, how am I going to fill this space?" And, when you become an adult and start writing, you're like, they tell you the opposite.
I
Make it
know.
1 page. And you're like, "How can I do this in
How
1
can I
page?"
get it all in there? Yeah.
Yes,
Yes, and
absolutely.
she's Colleen was a tough editor. She really stuck to the word. There's a very few where the word count maybe went over a little bit. But they're pretty much
Imagine
all
going
the
back to,
same.
like, Barack Barack Obama. "Sorry, you gotta eliminate
Or
250
Ge
lines." Just
or George W. Bush, who wrote the first essay on
yeah.
George Washington, and the lesson was, and because it was released on President's Day, and these essays get released every week, and every Tuesday is a president, and every Thursday is a first lady, if there is one, that we're doing. Not every first lady's been written about, the majority have. But by the end of the year, all of the essays will be out. I wrote the one on Bess Truman, who I really enjoyed researching about for my book, and felt hers was a story that needed to be told too, and how influential she was behind the scenes. In fact, Harry Truman was criticized for relying on his white wife so much, and she was sensitive to the fact that she was an advisor to him. But his response to the reporter that criticized him was, "Well, why wouldn't I listen to her? She has better judgment than anyone else around me."
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, man. So what's next for you?
Yeah, the good question. I really have so enjoyed lifting and raising the profile of American first ladies and their role in our country, in the presidency, in the White House, and so there's definitely still more there to do. We've just updated our book, Remember the First Ladies, the Legacies of America's History Making Women. So I'm back out on the road, bringing those stories to organizations all over the country, which has been great. Um, so I think, thinking about what the next book might be to write about, I'm not sure, but I do want to do another one. But in the meantime, I'll still be out there speaking and sharing, the stories of American first ladies.
Anita, this was an amazing interview. So much awesome stuff here. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for all that you are doing.